single A rated. These are, it's not even triple A. If you're a corporate with single A bond rating, that means you're not gold, but you know, you're somewhere between gold and silver. Market's not worried about you not making your promises. Compared to treasuries of similar maturity, such bonds on average pay about 75 basis points more. So if treasuries are yielding 375, you should expect a single A bond, single A rated bond to pay 4.5. That's another thing I want you to read about the bond ratings. On the other hand, let's look at the single B. Bonds that are rated triple B or higher are called investment grade. Double B, single B, and lower are called junk bonds or high yield bonds. So if Treasuries yield 375, a single B rated bond would pay about 675. And these days, the expected default probabilities on those 5-year default probabilities are about 2%. So only in 2% of the cases, you expect the company not to pay. Even when they don't pay, you don't lose everything. There is some recovery. The market says, I'm going to ask for 3% more. That's the default risk premium. Or let's look at the AAA. For example, Apple would be an example of a AAA. Even Apple pays 35 basis points more than US Treasury. So if US Treasury is paying 375, Apple is going to pay 410. With practically zero chance of default. But who knows what's going to happen in 10 years? You know, back in mid 80s, late 80s, Apple was AAA rated company. By 1998, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. Why? They had fired Steve Jobs. They begged him to come back. You know, he made them what they are today. But as of 1985, you didn't think that Apple was going to be in trouble. These are corporations. Back in 1950, the motto of the politicians were anything good for GM is good for US. And by 2008, even before that, GM was bankrupt. I mean, GM was the Microsoft of the car industry. Think of it that way. Let's briefly talk about what sort of things drive the yield curve. So let's do my approximation of a chart. And by T, I'm going to use the time to maturity. Let's start with the real rate, okay? Real yield curve. I mean, we've just seen from here, yeah, 5 year. 5-year tips yield about 145. 10 years, 159. 30 years, 194. Okay. And you could primarily think of that as interest rate risk premium, right? Because longer term maturities have, remember, there is no inflation risk. These are all US treasuries, so no liquidity risk differential, no taxability differential, no default risk differential. So let's do a call this real yield. The real yield curve tends to be upward sloping, and primary reason for that is what you want to call uh, interest rate risk premium. Then on top of that, we're going to add something like that. This differential is inflation risk premium. How much inflation you expect kind of varies over time, but even if it's constant, you're going to add on top of the real. Then if there are differentials on default, by the way, the order of these things are arbitrary. They're just the rates that I want to talk about. And maybe add liquidity risk premium. Then you can add taxability. But typically, I wouldn't put taxable bonds and non-taxable bonds on the same yield curve. Those are the kinds of things you expect in a yield curve. In terms of what sort of shapes do you expect? Generally, you expect an upward sloping yield curve on normal times. But inflation, suppose inflation is expected to be a lot lower in the short term, a lot lower than average, let's say, or a lot lower than normal in the short term. But later, low inflation and or short-term interest rates in the near future and reversion to normal later. Then I would expect the initially rates to go down by maturity, then do something like that, which is kind of what we have right now. Because we expect the Fed to reduce the short-term interest rates. Remember, you fund a long-term bond with shorter-term borrowings. Whether or not you actually borrow is besides the point. That's your opportunity cost. Whenever I choose to buy a 5-year bond, I'm giving up the opportunity to buy a 3-month bond, okay, or T-bill. So whether or not you're actually borrowing doesn't matter. Economically speaking, it's as if you are. But if my borrowing cost in the short term is going to decline, I don't need that much yield for the shorter term bonds. So it initially comes down. Sometimes you have a hump shape that says high or higher interest or inflation in near future and reversion later. Every once in a while, you're going to see something like this. That means you expect inflation rates and or short-term interest rates to remain low for a long period of time. Okay. By the way, something like this typically, when the 1 year or 3-month rates are lower than 10-year or 30-year rates are higher than 10-year or 30-year rates. It's called inversion of the yield curve. It's kind of an inverted yield curve. The market considers that a sign of possible recession. Doesn't always work that way, but at least slower growth. And let's just look at the current yield curve. There's Market Watch. And then I'll send you guys home. I know I kept you a minute longer, but you know, there's a cost of wisdom sometimes. The black one is pretty much that. So it levels off around 3-4 years, and after that it goes up. That means at least over the next 2 years, inflation and or interest rates are going to be much lower than now. Let's look at the same thing in Germany. The so-called Bunds. You're probably thinking Bund is the German word for bond. No, Bund is the shortening of the treasuries in German, or federal means Bundesrepublik. Bundes is federal. Germany is also a federal republic. See how the yield curve is different. It's actually hump-shaped, kind of humped. It's expected to go up and come down a little bit. That means in the short term, the market does not expect too much interest rate cuts. They expect a little bit after about a year, then level off. So these are not global things. Let's stop here. Remember, read rest of the chapter. There are a lot of descriptive stuff, and they're going to come up A in Jeopardy and B in the exam. On Monday, we're going to play Jeopardy on Chapter 6, and on Wednesday, we're going to do the first midterm covering Chapters 2, 3, and 6, and I'm going to post those problem videos and stuff this afternoon, all right? Including the lecture videos if you missed any.